There's some serious problems with modern dating, and it's because most conversations about modern dating happen on the internet. So, naturally, let's have another conversation with it, or about it, on the internet. Hi, I'm Nick. This is 10 Minutes with Nick. And why do I think there are some serious problems with conversations about modern dating? Well, we got into it a little bit in the last podcast, but there I was more focusing on where to find good advice. And so then naturally I went hunting for good advice. Just to, try to look for the other side of the argument. If I make an argument, I always have a tendency to hunt for the other side of the argument, to sort of almost disprove my own point. I want all the information. If I say it's a left turn to get to Albuquerque, I will go searching for the information that proves that it's actually a right turn to get to Albuquerque, if for no other reason than to know that what I was saying about the left turn to Albuquerque is correct, and I can share that information with vigor and aplomb. So I went hunting for advice, dating advice, podcasts. I didn't find any good ones. That's a big concern. So I went looking for any good advice. And I very, very quickly found just more and more and more disturbing information. It's one thing when you see comedians joking about stuff, right? Like Andrew Schultz is very irreverent and he talks about all sorts of stuff. I find him hysterical. You don't have to, but I do. But it's another thing when you start to see these people with these giant followings who give a ton of advice, and specifically to young men. Fortunately, one of those larger platforms is a guy named Andrew Tate. Now, as an adult, I believe in absolute free speech. You're allowed to say whatever you want. And if you're an idiot, I at least know you're an idiot. And I can ignore you. I don't need you to be deplatformed for me to ignore the bad stuff coming out of your mouth. I do get concerned when guys like this have a giant following. And I get concerned not because they don't have a right to speak, but because their audience almost always consists of the most impressionable among us. And that specifically would be young men. Young men ages like 12 to 16, let's call it. It's not hard to see the effect guys like Andrew Tate are having. Now, they're not having an outsized effect, right? Like, I would say that we're not in any danger right now of the next generation of men in Gen Z and Gen Alpha growing up to be a bunch of Andrew Tates. I also see, as a pushback to guys like Andrew Tate, I also see way too hard a pushback. Not on the toxic stuff. Not on, pimping out young girls on camera for money. That's something nobody should support, and if you do support it, why? Why do you support that? I don't get that. But Andrew Tate also is a guy who says, kind of common sense things, or things that used to be common sense when I was young, like, eat good food, stay in shape, pursue. When you're chasing a young woman, and again, I make this warning every time I speak on this podcast, but to all my LGBTQIA plus listeners, if I have any, I'm speaking from my experience. I would love to hear your experience if you have it, if you are willing to share it, but I don't have that experience. I can't speak from it. So I speak from the male experience in sort of straight relationships, and that involves pursuing the lady usually. To be pursuing, to be in shape, to take care of yourself, all these basic things that we talked about in the last podcast. Then guys like Andrew Tate pile on all this toxic stuff on top of it. Like, the gateway is the basic advice that nobody gives you, and then they pile on all the toxic stuff. Same thing that guys like Myron and Gaines and the Whatever podcast do. The Whatever podcast, I'll give the Whatever podcast a little bit of credit. They're a discussion. I should have said this in the last podcast. They're a discussion-based podcast more than they are an advice-based podcast. What comes out often sounds like advice and they're a very, very popular platform. So the message they end up communicating out is the same message that I talked about last time, which is, a lot of girls are stupid. But it's hard to get a clear vision in some of the most consumed media out there, a good, strong, clear image of healthy dating. Now, there are some social media accounts that do a pretty good job with this. There are some podcasts, I'm sure, I haven't found them, but there are some that do a pretty good job of this. But they don't get views. They don't get the clicks. Why? Well, because we're a community, we're a world that's become obsessed with not just the clickbait style conversations, but we're obsessed with the most shocking, because the most shocking is what seems to grab the algorithm and set it on fire. I'll use the Whatever podcast as an example. They're a very, if you watch or listen to the whole thing, it's a 45-minute conversation, and there's a lot of pleasantries throughout that conversation. The stuff that gets clipped out and probably drives a lot of viewership is the stuff where Brian or Andrew or somebody is really pushing these kind of just weird questions to try and embarrass or, own one of the girls they invite onto the podcast. And they typically invite a whole room of women with different opinions, but they'll target certain ones. And look, I'm not a fan of OnlyFans. I've said it before, I'm saying it again. And I'm not a fan, I don't think there's any reason ever that you should go on OnlyFans. If you're in that situation, we as a society have failed, and we need to find ways to prevent you from having to go on OnlyFans. But we shouldn't punish you because we collectively have failed. And that's essentially what you're doing when you're berating somebody who works on OnlyFans. You're punishing them. That's the kind of weird balance you have to, that's another discussion for another day. But what comes out of that, don't listen to the advice that comes out of that statement I made. Well, what advice do you listen to? Well, I don't know. That's not a good position to be in. I wish I had good advice to give you, or at least to point you to say, hey, go listen to this advice. My advice would be go listen to God. How do you do that? Well, you start off by reading your Bible. You start off by figuring out, okay, what faith community can I be in and stuff like that. I'll have a discussion about how to get into Christianity on another podcast. It's a 10-minute podcast. I don't have time for all of it today. But for people who don't believe in God, where do you go? Well, you find the people in your community who have strong relationships. And then you learn from them and you take from them what advice works for you, and you move forward. Is that helpful advice? I have no freaking idea. Because quite honestly, even the people who seem like they have healthy relationships, underneath the surface, it may not be. And that's a topic for another day. So congratulations. Today you got to listen to me ramble about a whole host of issues that will open up a whole host of other topics for us to discuss on 10 Minutes with Nick. However, today I'm at 10 minutes. I'm out of time. We have no more time for discussion. It's been lovely sitting here with you today. Glad I could be here, and glad you could be here if you were here. If you were here and you're new, welcome. Hit the subscribe button. I would love to have you sit around. There's stuff, oodles and oodles and oodles of content back for you to go watch. And if you didn't like this, then glad to see you. We'll talk to you maybe some other time, and maybe you'll find an episode you like better. But anyways, I got to go. I'm Nick. This is 10 Minutes with Nick. Have a great day.